I'd like to call the Planning and Community Development Committee meeting of Wednesday, July 25th to order. And anyone wishing to declare a potential conflict of interest should do so at this time. Entertain a motion to adopt the agenda. Moved by Councillor Seekers, seconded by Councillor Lutz. All those in favor? Motion is carried. Appointments and delegations. We have 3.1, Lori Vance from Habitat for Humanity. If you could just take a seat and press the red button or the beige colored button, it'll turn red. No, no, we should actually get one of those though. Okay.
Good afternoon, councillors. I wanted to come and speak with you today.
Excuse me, please. Okay, carry on.
I wanted to come, first of all, to speak with you today to thank you very much for all of the support we've had from the District of Sechelt, and also to be here today if you had any questions related to our submission for the application that we've put forward with regard to the strata registration. And for those of you that don't know why we're in this strata conversion place, just a little bit of history. When we built the project at the very beginning, I'll go back a number of years ago, long before I was ever associated with it, the board at the day decided that they didn't want to not occupy the houses that they were building. Obviously, the families that we're building for need these homes. And as a result, they moved everybody in prior to the registration of the strata with Victoria, which is what has forced us to be in the position today to have to apply for a strata conversion. So we always intended for these to be homes that would be owned eventually by these homeowners. But because we hadn't registered the title in Victoria, we were unable to separate the individual properties. So the individual homeowners have basically at this point in time up till now technically been renting, although the funds that they've been paying towards their rent are technically going towards their mortgage. So it's a little bit complicated behind the house, but it's all in place. However, I just wanted to be here today to explain to you why we've ended up being in this place. We had hoped that we would have been ready to submit the final 3 strata phases with today's application as well, but we're not quite at that point yet. Those 3 will be the final phases of the strata registration, and that will come probably sometime in the next 6 to maybe 8 months or so.
Okay. Any questions of committee? Councillor Seegers?
Thank you. So you're going to be setting up one strata. Each of the buildings is a phase, and you're just adding them all to the one strata.
That's right. At the end of the day, it will be one strata with the 7 duplexes, 14 homeowners, yes.
Okay, that's very clear. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Thanks very much for your presentation, Anne.
Thank you.
We look forward to dealing with it under business items.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
That's my question.
There you go. Okay, committees, commission minutes and reports. 4.1, we have the minutes of the Planning Community Development Committee meeting of May the 23rd. Entertain a motion for receipt. And moved by Councillor Seegers, seconded by Councillor Lutz. All those in favor, motion's carried. We have item 4.2, minutes of the Advisory Planning Commission meeting of June the 28th, 2018. A motion to receive. Moved by Councillor Seegers, seconded by Councillor Lutz. All those in favor, motion's carried. We have item 4.3, minutes of the Advisory Planning Commission meeting of July the 12th, 2018 for receipt. Moved by Councillor Lutz, seconded by Councillor Seegers. Equal opportunity here. New business, we have no new business. Business items 6.1. We have microbrewery and micro distillery zoning amendment proposal. And first of all, move receipt. Okay, thank you. And then we have the report from the municipal planner,
Megan,
dated
can you
July
pull up
16th. Okay.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'd like to do a short presentation. So in terms of why we're looking at this today is that we've had some interest from the business community in terms of opportunities that might happen in the downtown area. As well, in 2015, and this is a result of in 2015, the Liquor Control Board changed some of their licensing to loosen it up quite a bit and to allow certain things. And as a result, we'll just look here. Sorry. So in terms of what we're looking at today, we're looking at the downtown area, and this is a map of the official community plan. And the red areas are designated as downtown center. We're also looking at the C2 zone, and this is the map of that zone in terms of the hatched area located here. All in through here and up Inlet Avenue into that area, including the property we sit on right now. So in 2016, the town of Gibson's had some interest, and they adopted what's called, they defined a tasting lounge and a microbrewery as a manufacturing use. And then they made the microbrewery as accessory to the tasting lounge in terms of the size of the area. They used a percentage of gross floor area. And as a result of that, the 101 Brewhouse Distillery went into business, and it's a very successful combination of restaurant, brewing and distilling, as well as the tasting area. So they serve full meals as well there. And Gibson's Tap Works also went into the Gibson's Landing area, and they've been fairly successful as well in terms of doing their brewery. And they got just this past year, they're building an extension onto the roof to do a roof deck as well to expand their business. So what we are faced with and how we would look at that for Sechelt. Currently, our definition of restaurant is limited to dining establishment, and there are no definitions in the zoning bylaw for marine pubs or neighborhood pubs, although they're mentioned in the C7 and PA2 zones. So you can't very well see this, but this is our C2 zone, and the permitted uses are retail purposes, office, service, business, gasoline services, commercial schools, parking lots, residential purposes when they're above the ground floor, fitness center, libraries, child care facilities, drop-in center, home occupation, seasonal outdoor markets, and accessory buildings and uses customarily to the above, as well as mobile vending. So what we're proposing today is that we do an amendment to the bylaw where we incorporate new definitions of microbrewery, microdistillery, and tasting lounge. And then we look to include those in the C2 zone. Putting in a tasting lounge can be there, a microbrewery and microdistillery in conjunction with a tasting lounge or restaurant, and provided that it is no larger than 110 square meters of gross floor area, and that the effluent from the microbrewery and microdistillery is pre-treated prior to entering the community sewage treatment system. This is to address some concerns from our sewage treatment plant operator about the strength, and the Vancouver Coastal Health also pointed out that the strength of brewery effluent is quite high in nutrients, and it's best to have it pre-treated before it enters the community system. And provided then that there is community sewage treatment capacity. So looking at that, in terms of the gross floor area, we looked at, we didn't want it to be unusually large. That's approximately in the range of 1,200 square feet, 110 square meters. We believe that could support about 3 kettles. So we didn't want it to over industrialize the downtown area, nor become a very prominent use where that's the sole use. So we wanted it to be in conjunction with a kind of food establishment or tasting lounge. And our recommendation is that the bylaw that you have before us, before you get recommended to council, be given a first reading and referred to a public hearing. In terms of the community input we had from the Downtown Business Association and the Chamber of Commerce and the Advisory Planning Commission, all of them were in favor of this, and it was proposed originally as an accessory use. But in study, we feel like we can do it, it'd be much easier to administer if it's a set area, maximum size of the use within a building. Are there any questions?
Any members of the committee have any questions? Councillor Lutz?
There's no mention here of water use. It's my understanding that microbreweries use an awful lot of water. Does that come into this part of the zoning, or will that be up to the regional district to approve an increased use?
That will be up to the regional district. At the time of any of these applicants coming forward with a license application, we will be required to do some public consultation, and we can refer it to the regional district at that time to comment on the water use.
Carry on.
Thank you. So you're looking at limiting it to 110 square meters. What if we had a smaller building? Could it not just all be brewery?
Because we're in the commercial downtown core, we're trying to keep it as a mix. We would like to, if it's an industrial use such as a brewery, and that's all it is, it should go to the industrial area, because that would be the sole use of it. But we'd like to see some activity. If it's just a brewery, you're not going to get that dining experience or evening, social experience if it's strictly a brewery with a store. So we have other areas within the district where that would be appropriate in terms of industrial zoning, because they would be strictly doing manufacturing.
I'm just wondering if in the bylaw you wouldn't then necessarily put in something like maximum of 110 square meters or 50%, whichever is less. So that if you had a smaller size, they wouldn't have 110 square meters, right? But if you're saying maximum 110 square meters, but they have a small building, then it still allows the tasting lounge, for example, but it could be still primarily a brewery or a distillery.
We believe that one kettle would take it could still be a brewery with one kettle, and that would be approximately 1/3. So you're looking at roughly 350 to 400 square feet. So I think most of the buildings in the downtown could support that. And we're talking solely about this limitation on size being in the downtown core. There's no limitation to size in any other zone at this time.
Do we have a C2 zone anywhere but downtown?
No, we do not.
Okay, so how do we allow these other places if there's no zone that they're allowed in other than what's downtown? I notice in the, I think it's from the APC, where they talk about having tasting rooms, microbreweries, and distilleries in C2 and PA2 zones. Is there any reason why we're not looking at the PA2 as well?
They included that PA2 zone as the part for the Gilligan's Pub. It's one of the few PA2 zones, other than the Legion Hall, that we have in the district. There are only the 2 properties. And it's quite an unusual zone where it allows neighborhood pub. I think it comes from the 1970s, early 80s, when it was considered assembly uses. And so they put it into public assembly zone.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's all I have at this moment.
Okay.
Let's see what else I can.
Councillor Lutz, you have any questions? Yeah, thanks for those comments, Councillor Seegers. Perhaps staff can make a note of those suggestions and bring those forward in the report from this meeting. And we may well find at the public hearing that there's some consensus on that as well. Thanks very much. So we need somebody to make recommendation number 2. Councillor Lutz moves. Councillor Seegers seconds, hopefully.
I'd like to see it amended.
You'll to what?
So if you go to page 31, under Q number 1, it It says microbrewery or microdistillery in conjunction with a tasting lounge or restaurant, provided that the gross floor area of the microbrewery and microdistillery combined does not exceed 110 square meters of gross floor area or 50% of floor area, whichever is less.
You in agreement with that, Councillor Lutz?
And we can look to staff for feedback on that,
Yeah.
whether or not they'd support that piece. If it makes sense, or am I totally out to lunch?
Let's hear from staff then.
I think what we had originally thought was that this would be large enough for a couple of properties, that we weren't, because many of the properties in the downtown core are smaller. And the official community plan talks about kind of neighborhood feel, small shops, restaurants. We weren't thinking of a huge establishment such as Steamworks in Vancouver. I don't know if you've been there. Yaletown Brewery is the same. There's the Canoe one in Victoria. All of them are quite large establishments. So that's what we were looking for, something it would kind of fit with why we didn't include the 50%, because you might get something that's 1,000 square meters, 500 of which are kettles. So that's the kind of what we were thinking, what's reasonable and for the downtown.
Hi, through the chair. Just wanted to get a little more input. What's anticipated, so we can make sure that it's actually written, but what would be a situation that you're thinking of, or size or location or anything, and then we can get better wording around that.
I'm not looking at anything in particular right now, but we could have somebody where they come in and take up a number of buildings or number of sites, right? A number of locations. You know, it's very easy to knock some of those walls down in some of those buildings and have a bigger facility. And if we're saying 110, it may or may not work, and it might be too big. I don't, right? If they, a small one, they've got 100, they can go to 110, is what we're saying.
Correct.
If it's bigger, then we want to limit them to 110. But if it's more the smaller ones that I'm looking at, that if it becomes the whole building, basically, then we're looking at 110 square meters, and you'd have a little thing out front for tasting, which would be allowed under this.
Would that be problematic?
That would be probably, well, it could be. I mean, that's not what I hear you're anticipating we put forward for downtown.
No, but it could. I mean, there are those that, I can think of one in another municipality, that's exactly what it did. It's got a much smaller component on the tasting lounge. It's in the downtown, but at the edge. Would that be problematic? I don't know. Or do we need another different process, or it's under DP? I don't know. But is the concern about it just getting too much of the brewery within an area? Is that the concern?
Well, what I'm hearing is we want to have food, we want to have a tasting lounge, we want to have an experience, right, for people. So if we're saying 110, they can go to 110. That's the maximum. But what if their space isn't much bigger than that? Yes. So what I'm saying is the maximum 50% or 110. So that gives us more of a whichever is less is what I'm looking at,
Whichever is less, yeah.
right? Does that make sense? Yeah. Then they'll have a big enough space for the 110 if that's what they're looking at, or they'll keep it smaller and still have the proportional. That's right. That's what I'm looking at. Yeah. Okay.
So are we all right with the motion that has been amended? And seconded? Okay. Those in favor of the amendments? Okay, those in favor of the amended motion? Okay, thanks very much. We're good. Okay, that produced some clarity for staff. Good. Moving on to item 6.2, BC Housing Development Permit Application. Motion to receive. by Councillor Lutz, seconded by Councillor Seegers. All those in favor? And we have the report by the municipal planner. Please. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, members of the committee, I'll just run through the PowerPoint presentation. As you recall, we have an application before council at this time at second and third reading. We've gone through the public hearing process. We're at second and third reading, and there are a number of conditions to be fulfilled before final adoption of the bylaws. And in terms of those, one of the conditions was a development permit to guide the form and character of the application. In terms of background, we have the location of the site is on High Tide Avenue and backs onto Lamprey Lane. And there's an undeveloped portion of High Tide Avenue here. And one of the conditions of rezoning is to do with a road exchange, which will see a 2-meter closing of High Tide Avenue along this strip. And so that has yet to come forward, but will be one of the conditions that you'll see. And this development permit is thus conditional on that going through. Although we don't want to tie the hands of council, but at this time, the only way this could be approved would be with that, that condition in there. In terms of the surrounding uses, we have the Community Services Bank, the shelter and commercial area, Wharf Avenue, and there is a 21-unit rental apartment building here. There's a storage facility down in this location, and the Ebb Tide Townhouse Village area development. Water Resource Center is over here, some more townhouse developments and a duplex. And there's also a proposed site here for additional townhomes. So in terms of this is an aerial photograph, you can see that currently part of the road goes over the property here. And then you can see quite clearly a trail that the community has been using to go through. So it's important to keep that pedestrian access open, and that will be looked at as well through here. Another couple of shots of the property, the end of the road. So in summary, the development permit to Area 7 guidelines, they talk about site planning and the relationship to adjacent uses. They talk about building form and character, exterior materials, the accessibility and sustainability, the landscaping and perimeter screening, the common areas, safety, security, and lighting, and the parking being provided. The other parts of this that are not applicable are actually the signage. Signage will have to come through as a sign permit because it hasn't been included. So if there is signage, that will be coming forward and be dealt with at staff levels, provided it meets the sign bylaw. There is no public art. Staff feel that the public art as a recommendation from the OCP is not really that applicable to a very low income housing development. And the archaeological is a condition of the rezoning. So that is still underway and they'll be looking at that, completing that soon. In terms of the proposal, we have the proposed CD zone, and the development permit application meets that in terms of all of the types of things that we've looked at in the CD zone. And so that's dependent on the housing agreement. And the preliminary servicing plan was received, and you can see here where we've got the sidewalk will be continuing through. We have some parking here that's perpendicular to continue the parking that's in front of the neighboring apartment building. And that's an off-site parking. And there's a number of, this is a walkway here, will be put all the way on the pavement, but will be delineated all the way to Wharf Avenue. This is a perspective drawing. The staff worked with the architect to enrich the color scheme to bring some more life and to the building, and I think that's been very successful. And we have some samples, yeah, if you could show those around of the colors. So while the drawings are there, they are a little bit distorted, but you can see the colors are, the actual colors there, they're marked on the panels. So there's a number of panels as like types of hardy plank siding to give it some relief, as well as the different colors themselves. In terms of the site plan development, you can see that there's been some change here. The parking is at the back. There's 5 parking spaces plus the loading area. And this is also got the covered parking that's being proposed for the 15 bicycle spaces. We also have a recycling and garbage center here, enclosure along the edge. There's a potential pet dog run and a couple of equipment sheds. And then we've got some landscaping. There's also a patio area and a small gazebo in here with vegetable garden. And you can see the setbacks that are met here. So there's a proposed 3-meter setback, and this would be the new side property line. If we looked at this with the existing property line, it would be 1 meter away here. If for whatever reason the road exchange and disposition does not go through, we will bring it back for a variance, for council's consideration of a variance to that side yard setback. In terms of the main floor plan, you can see here the entry and the entry lobby reception. There's a little tenant support office, a medical office, staff room, janitor. They have switched up the kitchen and the pantry because it makes more sense to be close to the loading area right here. There are 2 exit stairwells for emergency access in here and for access upstairs. They're providing 8 wheelchair accessible units on the ground floor. The other 2nd and 3rd floor are exactly alike, and they provide 16 units on each floor. Windows for the units are all to the end here. The only windows at the facing south and to the north are for the stairwell itself. So in terms of the west elevation facing High Tide Avenue, this is the look of the building on High Tide. You can see here this post is marking the entrance and the walkway there. This is what's going to face Lamprey Lane. Now this is without any landscaping because there is significant dense per landscaping that isn't showing. So this is pretending what the building is like when you're right there. The south elevation facing High Tide Avenue, again, the entrance is right in here. And the north elevation. While these may look like windows to sort of imitate that kind of look of an apartment building, they're concrete opaque panels. The only windows, again, facing towards the neighborhood, to the neighboring building, are these windows in the stairwell and the corridor. This is a drawing that indicates the colors and the location of those and the types of materials. Other one feature I would like to point out is the roof line. It comes and drops down here and then comes back up. And that reflects what's happening in the neighboring apartment building that goes from 3 to 2 stories. It gives a little more variation of, and you also see some knee bracing that's happening in here. So if I go back, the knee bracing occurs on the front buildings here, in here. It's a decorative feature. It's not really supporting anything, but it will help to break up the mass of the building. And we'll just, in terms of landscaping, we've got significant perimeter landscaping along all 3 sides here. A little less in this area, which will face this treed buffer before it gets to the road. And it faces south, so there'll be good light there. And the plant list is pretty significant. Things like rosemary, thyme, garden phlox, Virginia, most of them are very low maintenance and fairly drought tolerant. Blueberries, but mostly Portuguese laurel, a lot of laurel to help. They will grow quickly and fill in as well to offer a buffer. The other proposed development permit conditions we've received a landscaping estimate in the amount of $24,993.75 for on-site landscaping. We'd like to see that all on-site exterior lighting be downcast and energy efficient and provided at all entrances and exits of the main building and all walkways. And retention of the mature fir tree located in the southwest corner of the site. And just to show you where that is, let me go back here. It's not indicated, but right now it's located right in here, and I think it could be easily fit within the type of the overall scheme that's happening there. So, and that means that during construction they'll erect a snow fencing around it to protect the root ball. In terms of the recommendations, we're looking at, subject to the adoption of the official community plan and zoning amendments, that it be adopted, and the partial road closure of the High Tide Avenue, that the development permit be approved with those conditions that I've already outlined, and that there's a list of schedules A and B drawings, the landscaping bond, the lighting, and the mature fir tree. And that's it. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Are there
Thank
any
you very much.
questions?
Committee have any questions? Councillor Lutz?
Is there the opportunity for picnic tables, benches where the more mature trees are, the existing that are shown in that?
So
Yeah,
on this
somewhere
public
amongst
road
there.
right away, part of we did get a landscaping estimate to clean up that area and to remove the invasives. It's not a lot of money, but that's in there. I think what we could look at that is having our Parks Department look at memorial benches or something of that nature.
Be great.
Could happen in there.
Councillor Seegers?
Thank you. You mentioned the road closure bylaw. Do you have any idea when that would be coming forward?
We're waiting right now the drawings to accompany the bylaw, so we'll be looking hopefully in the next within the next month.
Okay. And on
Possibly
page-
this September 1st, that's the first meeting in September.
Thank you. Page 37, under accessibility, it talks about no wheelchair ramp access is proposed from High Tide Avenue. So where is the wheelchair access?
So I apologize that was one of my original comments to the APC, but it did get changed. There is an access ramp here. While it doesn't show that it continues onto the roadway, we can make sure that that happens, that it's continuous down here through the servicing agreement.
Okay.
And there's also the area in here did not require a ramp. It's just sloped itself there to the site plan.
Okay, and it also talks in there about lowering the building.
And they did lower the building, and
they?
I apologize, I should have taken those out.
Okay.
They did lower the building, but you can see that through the construction process, it is a little bit higher. That is due to the way that they construct these modular units and then bring them on. They are on a small crawl space rather than being sitting on a slab.
Okay.
So they are slightly elevated.
Okay, and then there seems to be some conflicting information in here about the stormwater management. There, under accessibility, it says the site plan indicates accessible parking space as eco-grid gravel, and it would need to change to a hard surface to facilitate accessibility. But then if you go to the next page, it talks about rainwater ground filtration will occur in the parking area, which is eco-grid gravel. So what is it going to be, and how are we dealing with that?
So we need to, the building code and our building bylaw requires that the accessible space be paved with hard surface so that scooters and walkers, that kind of thing, have a firm surface to walk on. And so that means that this space here needs to get paved and then a paved access to the main entry.
So how do we deal with the stormwater management? They'll have to come up with a stormwater management plan for the lot, taking those into account?
They will, yes.
Okay, and then one final thing in there, it talks about covered enclosure accommodating recyclables, green waste, and garbage bins.
So that did come back in the revised, these are the revised drawings, and it did come back as covered. It is covered in here and enclosed.
Okay, so because the green waste, if we're looking at organics, that could be an issue with animals, and we'd have to figure out how to deal with that.
My understanding from speaking to the staff person who looks at waste is that the district is moving to that, to doing waste for all of the green waste as well as recyclables for all of the multifamily buildings. There's also the potential, what's showing on the site plan is one of these kind of industrial composters that's kind of sealed unit that rotates. It's quite a large drum. And so they will be probably composting a lot of their own green waste as well
Okay.
for their garden.
All right, and then parking. I like the addition of the 9 parking stalls on there. That was one of the concerns we had before,
Yes.
to ensure that there was sufficient parking for staff as well. All right, thank you very much.
Any other questions from committee? Entertain a motion for recommendation number 2. By Councillor Seekers, seconded by Councillor Lutz. All those in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you very much. We have item 6.3, Habitat for Humanity Strata Title Conversion Application. Entertain a motion to receive. Moved by Councillor Seegers, seconded by Councillor Lutz. All those in favor? Motion's carried, and we have a report from the community planner, please.
Close enough. Thank you, Chair, members of committee. As mentioned, what this item is a strata title conversion application for Habitat for Humanity. Covering this, the whole development is 7 duplexes, 14 units. As mentioned, this application only covers the phases 1, 2, and 3. Fairly straightforward process on this one. Usually, strata title conversion applications can be complex when it involves displacing rental. And a lot of communities will have certain policies around vacancy rate and when they'll allow conversions and that sort of thing. Because of the business model of Habitat for Humanity, this is not about displacing anybody. This is really to facilitate their business model. It does require under the Strata Property Act that there be a resolution to permit this in order to move forward and to allow it to be registered in land titles. So it's certainly, there's certain criteria that the Property Act states. This is certainly in keeping with all of that in terms of it being an affordable housing project. This is much more at this stage with this kind of model, more of a technicality. So it does require council approval, and once that is provided by council, the approving officer can stamp it and get that registered.
I'll move
Any questions of
recommendation number
committee?
2.
Okay. All right. No, there being no further questions, let's call the question. All those in favor? Thanks very much. I just wonder, as a comment, I see a couple of reports have the recommendations in bold print and others do not. Is there any particular reason for that, or can we just request that they be in bold print?
It can be bold. Yeah.
Yeah.
My error.
It just seems to stand out.
Okay.
For us visually impaired people, so. Okay, thank you very much. Moving along to item 6.4, accessory dwelling units, development permit application. Move receipt. All those in favor? Motion's carried. And a report from the Director of Planning, please.
Thank you. So the application in front of you was presented to council and referred back to committee through resolution. So there's actually 2 elements to this of seeking guidance on in terms of moving forward. One is related to this particular application as to does it fit within the zoning. There were some unusual interpretations in terms of gross floor area that effectively allow coach house. So we're seeking guidance from council on is that the intention. We do have some other similar ones coming forward that are actually cottage 1-story that we normally approve through minor development permit. It doesn't come to council. So it's seeking direction on how should this be approached. So the application is for 4648 Whitaker Road. This is in Davis Bay. Application for guest cottage. It's under R1 residential zoning. Under R1, it allows a guest cottage on lots above 2,000 square meters. This lot meets that requirement. And it allows a maximum size of 55 square meters, so just under 600 square feet. And this is where the application got interesting on it in terms of how we are interpreting this. The upper level of the guest cottage proposal certainly falls within that and meets those requirements. Under the definition of floor area, it exempts out certain things, and one of them being ancillary parking, and that has been interpreted to allow a parking structure under a guest house, which in my interpretation of that would suggest that's a coach house or a carriage house, and depending on location could be a laneway home. If that's the intention, I wanted to get direction from council because we certainly have applications that would like to do that. We don't actually have a definition for that. So it's just to get some guidance. Is that what is intended, in which case we can guide our applicants a little bit more? The other is that if that is the intention, we can probably put an interpretation memo out that just gets clear on what applies and where. This is the site plan. It is in your package. It's a little hard to see in this location, but it's quite a large lot with the principal house being at the back of the lot, and the proposed guest cottage being in the front. The septic area is in the middle of the bend there. So these are a number of photos taken from this from the area. The applicant is in the audience and can speak to this if the chair so desires. He was kind enough to send these pictures in for me. So this first one is photo of the neighbor's home, and the guest cottage being will be to the right of that. The next one shows where that site area is relative to the driveway coming off Whitaker. This is essentially the neighbor context. There is a small home just up the street on the same side of this, 1 story. And then once you're past that on Whitaker, it's quite mixed. There's everything from very small scale to the back end of the west, which is quite a significant development. This is the building site, and then the site location looking up that blue-greenish building is the applicant's home. So that's where it would sit relative to the lot and to the street. This is taking a photo from down from the house, and then you can see the neighbor context along the roadway there.
So, yeah, just looking at that angle, so the new structure would be to the right of the driveway, right? Correct?
On the first picture.
If you're looking up from the road,
No, if you're looking.
if you're looking
from the
down,
house down.
it's almost straight ahead into the bushes,
Blackberries,
the blackberry
right.
bushes.
Yeah, okay, that's-
Straight ahead, that would
Yeah,
be the
'cause
location.
Before, I think you said it was on the right, but in fact, it was on the left when you're looking up from the road. It's okay.
The other
It's okay.
right,
We-
you're
we
correct.
figured it out. We're okay. Just looking at the diagram, it would appear to be on the left of the driveway as you're going up.
It is, sorry,
Yeah,
it's on
that's
the other
okay.
side of
We're
the
good.
neighbor's lot that I meant to say.
That's all right.
Sorry.
That's right. The other left. Yeah.
The other right.
Oh, no.
So this was the request for clarification of where we needed to get guidance from council on what was intended, committee, and then what kind of standards, because we're kind of mixing our standards a little bit. In terms of the rules that apply to height, most guest cottages fall under the accessory building regulations, so under 6 meters. When we look at setbacks, under an accessory building and structure, you'd only need a 1 meter setback from any lot line, including the front. So for anything being set in front yards, that would mean you've got pretty close interface into the road. So wanted some guidance on, is that the application standard that should apply, or should we apply the same standard setback of 5 meters that you would do for a principal dwelling when we're doing something like this? Some of the other questions that came up is, does DPA number 8 apply when you're doing an infill housing? And there were questions raised around these, both from applicants wanting to do this and concerns that have come up through other mechanisms of should short-term rentals be okay on these kind of structures.
Can I ask you to go back to where you're coming along Whitaker towards the driveway?
First set of photographs.
There. So are they going to, is the plan to access the garage off Whitaker or off the driveway?
Off the driveway.
Okay. And do we have any determination yet in terms of what setback that would be from the road?
It's 5 meters, is it not? Yeah,
5
it is
meters?
5 meters. So
5 meters? Okay, so it's, yeah, okay.
yeah, the only setback that wasn't in alignment with a house was the side yard adjacent to the neighbor's property where the driveway curves in. That was at 1.2, I believe, there. 1.25? 1.5? Yeah.
It should meet all the setbacks for any kind of.
Okay.
1.83.
Sorry?
It says 1.83.
I thought I had it in there.
You can make it
And,
bigger.
So they are meeting essentially for single detached.
Yeah.
and will the guest cottage park in the garage or have another parking area?
That is the parking is contained underneath it. It's essentially a 2-car garage. And there's significant room at the top as well, so the parking wasn't an issue. These were the photos that were shown in the council package around what conventional terminology is around cottage, granny suite, usually either a 1-story or 1 and loft. Carriage, coach, and laneway houses, that ends to be over the garage area. And then this is for the regulations and standards. So if we were applying, and again, if these are in rear yard, the issues aren't really as significant. It's when it's in a front yard condition, it makes a difference. So it's if we applied the single family detached of the 5 meter front yard setback, but the height wouldn't apply because that would be at 10.5. Accessory at 6. So we're currently, the way the bylaw is structured, it's a little bit of picking and choosing. So it's just trying to get some clarity on what should we apply, what is reasonable for front yard conditions, what would be reasonable for where it's in rear yard, or do we need to do anything about that? If it meets certain conditions and standards, can it just remain as minor DP and we can do that internally? If it's something else, does it constitute a major DP, in which case council is approving on that. So in terms of this, before I move on to the other, in terms of this particular development permit, it's seeking that direction of how should it be addressed? Is it major? Is it minor? Should a development permit, if it's major, we will bring the development permit itself forward to council with a recommendation. If there are certain standards, because we do have a number of other applications that are somewhat similar, if we are dealing with simply a one-story structure, meeting those kind of setbacks, is that problematic, and or can we just do that as a minor? So it's just needing some clarity there on how this one should be addressed, and then a broader question about future ones, what would trigger more process, and what can just be done as a minor DP or just subject to essentially building code and zoning check.
Members of committee, weighed in. Go ahead.
So it sounds like you're looking for some clarity around front yard versus backyard.
Yes.
1 story, 2 stories. And when there could be changes to that, depending potentially on topography, I guess topography and siting on the lot.
And the setbacks.
And setbacks, okay. Okay, and the other piece is around short-term rentals. Okay. Okay. Stop there for now.
Okay.
Councillor Lutz?
And I would think we also need to look at, because a lot of these things will be site-specific, how do we make it equitable? That's the part I'm having trouble with. If we give staff very strict rules and then have to ask them to break them because of site-specific, why are we making the rules? But if you don't have anything, how do you make decisions without bringing every one of them to council? This is difficult.
Yes, it is. Well, it's extremely challenging in a place like Sechelt because there's just so much variety in topography and lot sizes. And there are some lots, as I mentioned, that, if you're off Sechelt Inlet Road, those lots are extremely large. You could put 5 of them in, no one would notice. Not suggesting anyone do that. But, it's a large lot, and if we're really concerned around visual impact, the visual impact is managed very well there. We have others, in certain areas where it tends to downslope. It's very common to have the double car garage in there in the front yard, not too far from the road. And it's barely visible in terms of the roof line. So on those kind of sloping conditions, we probably wouldn't need much more than that. It fits, because the test is always what's the street edge condition, what's the visual impact on that streetscape. In others where it's a more level topography, it's just more noticeable. And so the issue there would be really more about the placement relative to the front yard and the height relative to the street. So there may be conditions there where if it's 1-story true cottage and it's a 5-meter setback, is that problematic? Because that would probably be in the line of most development anyway. So it's really looking at what would need to be in place for those ones kind of similar to this, where it's a 2-story structure, front yard either flat or up sloping, just to manage that streetscape condition, or is it problematic, in which case we can still stay with the status quo approach.
Time for the rose between 2 thorns. I would suggest, just off the top of my head, a minor DP in terms of addressing this, because we're going to have this discussion, I'm sure, with our zoning bylaw coming up, and laneways and cottages and this sort of thing. It does conform to a single-family residence in terms of setback. It's going to be lower in height than a single-family residence. I think if it's built into the hillside, it won't impact neighbors specifically. If it was the other side of the road, that might be a different matter, because even then, because those properties on that side of the road are so steep, they're not impacted by anything that would happen on the other side of the road in terms of restriction of view or encumbrances on view. So that would be my position in terms of dealing with this as perhaps expeditiously as we can, without going through a lot of extensive time and input at this point in time. Let's put it that way, because I think some of these issues will be addressed when we do the zoning bylaw. And as I pointed out the other day, on a dead level lot, there's one of these in East Porpoise Bay. You know, it's a substantial double garage with living quarters above, with actually a fairly tiny house in behind it, if you know the property. That there's no impact there either, because that's dead level. And I somehow think this isn't going to be a major issue in the neighborhood. And I think a minor DP at this time is probably something we should consider. Okay. I don't know how the rest of the committee feels about that. Councilor Lutz?
Thank you. I would agree. I think on this one, there are some exceptions because of the topography. My concern with the house or the guest cottage being placed where it is the sewer being above it, but I guess there's ways to deal with that. I don't so much like the outside staircase, but that's a personal, not bylaw issue. So I would be in favor of this particular one being approved, subject to the sewage. And bylaw looking at how we deal with others going forward.
Councilor Seegers?
Thank
Councilor
you.
Seegers?
Through you to staff, will these issues be dealt with in the new zoning bylaw?
Through the chair, the new zoning bylaw does contain definitions for it. It still didn't really address the guest cottage because it was actually still defined as it could go to the second, so we can fix that if that is the desire. An area where I think we could probably do more work, but I think it takes just more engagement work. There are a number of municipalities who have moved down this road and have fairly permissive requirements of where you are on sewer, where it is in rear yard, and particularly lane access. The lot size requirements are quite a bit smaller than what we have, so it allows quite a bit of intensification in certain areas. Yeah. But it would require, I think, a little more public engagement, or maybe it's in addition to it, concurrently with the zoning bylaw, of where those areas might make sense, what kind of standards, what kind of conditions would be. But again, when it's just one story and when it's in rear yard, it can go in a number of places. It's not visually impactful in most areas. It's really in this case, and the fact that the way we've defined it is a little unusual. I'm not sure a neighbor would, in looking at that, appreciate that you could get that two-story structure in your front yard. But we can certainly clean up the terminology, the definitions, and then what kind of rules. Particularly, I think in the new zoning bylaw, it gives an opportunity to do a lot more in specific use regulations, or having things as conditional uses subject to those. It provides a lot more guidance without having to kick it into an additional development permit process.
Right. Okay.
Do we have a timing for when that new zoning bylaw would be coming forward?
The critical path keeps changing on that. It's
That's another reason.
yes, another reason. It certainly has been in draft for quite some period. It has been, I must say, an interesting exercise in the last 5 months of me being here of the things that we do, of realizing we do need a lot more information on. And particularly the short-term rentals, so that specific use regulations section of the bylaw is getting larger. But I think it will make the actual application of it much more streamlined.
So at this
That
point.
was a
we-
weasel wording of saying I'm
Yes.
not quite sure, but I'm
Okay,
trying.
that's good. So we've got two issues before us then. One is this particular application, which it sounds like we've got support here to have that go forward as is, but you're still looking for some guidance beyond that for how to deal with, how to craft the information for others, et cetera, going forward. Okay, so,
We'll think about that.
yeah, well, I've got some ideas around that too that we can throw forward, at least to bring to council for discussion then. Okay, so we want to deal with the recommendation 1?
Yes. Motion number 1, or recommendation number 1 being moved? Oh, I'm sorry. So it would be number 1 then, wouldn't it?
With that address.
Sorry, if I may, if the decision of the committee is that to allow it to go forward as a minor DP, it doesn't need to go forward to council on that, on
Okay.
this particular element, right? It would
I
be,
need to add something.
it would be authorized by staff to permit the development permit as presented,
Okay.
okay? And then on the, other question about future ones, then that's guidance there.
Okay.
If we allow this one to go through, can we also stipulate not to be used as short-term rental without having to go to council?
Through the chair, we could put that into the development permit itself.
I would like to include that.
And the applicant seems to be in agreement with that.
So what do you want the motion to say? Minor DP with?
For this address,
Yeah.
with no short-term rentals allowed.
So
Is
minor
that-
DP with no short-term rentals for this address.
With this address attached to that motion.
Okay, do you want me to read a recommendation? or
Sure,
anything?
please.
Okay,
Help.
okay. That the development permit application for 4648 Whitaker Road be approved as a minor, or be, sorry, even I'm messing it up, be approved as a minor development permit, subject to the condition that the development not be used for short-term rental.
In sewer still. Is that lots where this popped up? Okay.
So are we in agreement with that recommendation?
Second?
First, seconded? All those in agreement? Good. Thanks for crafting that for us. Much appreciated.
Okay, I'd like to take a stab at some of the other pieces in this.
Yeah, same here.
Just, I mean, and this is to get something on the floor for discussion at council.
Yeah.
And probably it's also going to have to be referred out to the community associations at some point too. And would we do that here, refer it out to community associations, or would that come from council to be refer it out to community associations?
I think we should.
Yes, so if we put out some, like if we say, okay, carriage house is 1 story. If it's 1 story in the rear of the yard, if it has the setbacks of a house, of a regular dwelling, that it's minor and can be approved by staff. If it is a 2-story in a rear yard, it could also be approved by staff if it doesn't overshadow the neighbors, like you've got some things inside of your whatever here. if it's in the front yard, it needs to come to council and be referred out to communities and neighbors for input.
Could be site-specific, you're
Yeah,
saying.
and yes, and sites, and anything site-specific where the sloping lots and topography, whatever. I mean, at least it's a place to start.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is where we're gonna end up, but that gives us a place to start and then can go out.
And that can be
for
put
some
on the
feedback.
future
Yeah.
agenda for planning committee too, I think, for
So-
that discussion. And the bylaw too.
So through the chair, maybe it would be helpful, because this would actually allow it to kind of catch up as part of the zoning bylaws. It could come as a report to either the next PCDC, will depend on kind of the agenda close date, or the following one that would have kind of a variation of what is in here, of what our definitions are, what the reasonable setbacks were, and then in the process reflecting exactly that are kind of, these are the ones that it can just move forward.
Forward, yeah.
And for these, here we are, and then that report can be sent to the community association at the same time for their input.
Sounds good.
Yeah, hopefully make your job that much easier and ours as well, trying to deal with them.
Yeah, another term that I'm seeing in here, you've got accessory building, but you're also talking about accessory dwelling unit. And we don't have a definition for an accessory dwelling unit, so that will also have to be included. Okay, thank you.
I'll second that.
Okay, good.
Do we need a
Okay.
motion on the floor? That staff come back with a report outlining potential, minor, major development permits and provide guidance to council?
The Chair, I think it could be a rewording of number 3, that the committee recommend staff prepare a report for council that considers options that clarify the definitions and standards for the guest cottages and other accessory dwelling units.
So moved.
Second.
I knew there was a reason we have you in here, for sure. Oh, that's good. The big bucks, that's right. Thank you very much for that. It's much appreciated. All those in favor? Motion's carried. Thank you very much.
That gets us there.
Okay, and last but not least, we have item 6.5, Planning and Procedures Bylaw, request for consideration, and report from the director. Move receipt. So moved, seconded. All those in favor? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of committee. The report in front of you is proposing a new planning and development procedures bylaw. This replaces the bylaw that we currently have that was done in 2012, bylaw number 513, which is the Development Approval Procedures bylaw. And the changes proposed in it, there are a number of things that are reflected in this. So it covers primarily amendments and permits. So it took some things that were addressed in the previous bylaw out, mainly because we're not in total control of those processes. We make recommendations through it. And then included and developed a non-statutory guide that covers things like the subdivisions, applications to Agricultural Land Commission and the Liquor Control Board, and we will add to that now the cannabis regulations. So the non-statutory guide is written for a broader audience and in quite different language, and so I'll go through that in a little more detail of what that is. But that was the intention of the exercise. In the proposed changes in the bylaw itself, it includes the definition for minor development permit, and it uses scale, not dollar value. Our previous one had I could approve up to a certain dollar value, which may have made sense at the time it was written, but it's also hard just from looking at an application of knowing what that is. With scale, it's more definitive. We're not second guessing on it. On the notification requirements for amendments, so OCP amendments and rezonings, it's proposing to expand that to 100 meters from the current 50 meters. I haven't proposed a change to the temporary use permits and development variance permits. They're still at 50, but would look for any input on whether that should change as well. It clarifies the delegated authority. In reading the previous bylaw and some other procedures that, and through other bylaws that were in existence, I couldn't tell you what my delegated authority is. It was a little complex and a little circular, shall we say. It had a lot notwithstanding, so it just wasn't really clear.
Yeah.
So I've written it out as to what seems reasonable. A lot of it ties to the minor development permit. It adds an additional authorization to deal with the renewals of development permits. So if they lapse and no variance is being requested, that I can authorize that renewal. It includes things like facade improvements, that sort of thing, which would be really helpful for the downtown. Just reduces the amount of process that needs to go into something like that. There are a number of things that along that line that we put through a lot of process, but we don't usually alter it and we don't usually say no to it, so it seems like a lot of process. So it clarifies that. It clarifies the security requirements. They were in a number of different parts of the bylaw, so it just consolidates that. It gives a little more direction of what we take, why we take it, and how we draw it down. So how we can do the refunds as a project is moving forward, particularly in phases. And then it outlines the process steps to our applications related to amendments and the permitting process. So that is in the delegated authority. It still retains the flood control exemptions. This is a statutory requirement, but I've emphasized it into the bylaw that I can elect to refer to council, even if I've been delegated authority, if there is something that is in the public interest or there's something that it just warrants a little more scrutiny, allows me to do that. And the flip side of that is an applicant can always request a reconsideration, and there's process written in there as to what that is if they disagree with the decision of the director. So these are in minor development permit. So for form and character, it's additions and alterations that are below 100 square meters. In the intensive residential development permit area, it gives me the ability to approve when it's at the subdivision level on certain small lots. And to be honest, this is kind of a workaround to that particular DPA because it's a little bit onerous. And so this means that the applicant doesn't need to come to council for that. We can still look at it and examine if it's actually in keeping with the intent. But we had a number of lot sizes in this under small lot that aren't really that small and aren't really that intensive. And so that's what the intent of that. At some point we will update those and probably change the lotting on it. In environmental and hazard DPs, so this is everything from DPA 1 to 5, the steep slope, it allows, it continues with a single detached, 100 meters squared, alterations to retaining walls. We had, again, this was an area that it was hard to ascertain. We have a lot of applications that will come in where they're fixing a retaining wall or altering a retaining wall. It wasn't clear if I can approve those or if those need new process. So it just got clarity on that. Facade alterations, the sign applications, and this is the one area where it includes variance. And that is being proposed to allow variance not exceeding, where they don't exceed 30% of the allowable sign area. And the rationale behind that is some of our applications for signage, this is something we hear consistently, particularly from downtown merchants, is our sign bylaw is challenging. And it means a lot of development variance permit applications for fairly modest changes to it because there's no wiggle room in it, and it's quite definitive, and it's time consuming. It's quite expensive to do a development variance. We don't have a separate variance process for signage, so that was the rationale behind that. If it's more than that, it's probably into something a little different that probably needs council scrutiny on it. So that was the rationale on that one.
So permits still have to be taken out, though.
Permits are required, so you still have to abide by the sign bylaw. There's still a process in there. It just means that I can approve them as opposed to it coming through council. It also keeps it within the minor DP fee structure, so it's 500, it's not 1,500, and time.
Yeah, because I'm aware that some signs have not had permits, period, just because of the issue around it.
Yes. So again, that is an area where we do have some work to do, both in the updating the sign bylaw and in some of our development permit area guidelines of getting a little clearer on what's reasonable. I find in the downtown Sechelt one, there's some aspects of it that make absolute sense when it's along the Cowrie corridor, but we do have a mall and we do have other areas that fall within that are a little more industrial in larger scope that it's not particularly applicable or reasonable for that. Oh, that was it. Now, in terms of the guide, so in the guide, it does a number of things beyond the bylaw. What I wanted to build into it as well, for the benefit of applicants, but also to kind of assist the decision makers, is I've actually built in evaluation criteria into it. So when we're dealing with an OCP, what are the things we look at? What do we look at in rezoning? As my concern is when I see things that say it's in alignment with the OCP, the alignment with OCP goes far beyond simply does it fall within the designation and does it fall within the maximum density limit that you can apply. It needs to meet a lot of other policies. So this kind of lays that out of how we will evaluate, what kind of things the applicant needs to keep in mind. It also includes criteria around in a variance permit of what do we look at when moving those forward. So it includes a little bit more detail. The language is different. It's really geared to if someone is applying, what they need to look at. On page 5, it has what type of approval and permit process. So it's got a lot of those. If it's this, then you need this. If it's something else, then it's kicking into to another process. Particularly signals to the applicant that if something isn't fitting within there, you're looking at a variance permit or what our temporary use permits require. So it's not a surprise. And then it goes into a lot more detail on the process, particularly the aspects that affect the applicant. So there's much more detail around what the public information meeting looks like and what we want to hear back from and what we expect out of that, and a little more detail on the public hearing process. So that is the intent. I didn't write the recommendation on this one as giving the recommendation directly to council because it still needs, I really wanted more input and do another iteration, and then I would bring it to council as a bylaw with the guide. But because it's fairly extensive, it's relatively new, I just wanted to get a little bit of input from you first, and then I'll do another iteration. And that concludes my report.
Okay. Members of the committee have any comments? Oh, Councilor Seegers? Yeah.
Thank you. This is a lot of work. Thank you for all of this. I really like the procedure bylaw or the package you put together for the community. I do have some grammatical kinds of things for there. We won't do those now, but I'll come see you after with those kinds of things, okay? But the bylaw itself, I have a few questions on. So on page 96, 5.5, you say, director must inform the applicant either verbally or in writing why the application is incomplete. When would you do it verbally and when would you do it in writing? And why the differentiation?
Through the chair, in some cases, we've got them in a meeting, and we would go through that. But it may be one because this came up relatively recently of us not having written record on it, that that might need to be an area where we alter and we actually, no matter what we're doing, we've got a written record.
Yeah,
Would
that's what
that
I was
be your
thinking. That would be my
recommendation on that?
recommendation. It's always in
Okay.
writing, even if you verbally met with them.
Right.
Because then it's reiterated again, all the particular points.
Yeah.
It gives them the,
Okay.
not going from memory or what they've written down. Okay, so I'd say yes, in writing, why the application is complete.
Yeah.
Page 99, under notice of public hearing. So I'm just looking for, I don't understand this, and that's, I'm looking to you to explain this to me. 6.5, so we have to give notice of public hearing, to these various people, but then it says the above notification is not required if 10 or more parcels owned by 10 or more persons are subject to the bylaw amendment. What does that mean?
That means that instead of it being the individual properties that we're giving notification to, we do usually do the notification through the newspaper ad. So if we were bringing forward, say, an OCP amendment that affected the whole community, we wouldn't do individual notice to each one. So it allows us to do a different approach to that.
So that goes with 6.6?
Sorry, and that's under the Local Government Act.
Okay.
And typically, this microbrewery, microdistillery would be a perfect example. It will affect the C2 zone, but we are not required to notify every single owner and resident within the C2 zone of the proposed because there are more than 10. Does that make sense? We will still do the advertising and a public information meeting, but we will not do individual mailed out notification.
Okay.
Would you do the board like you do on?
Yes, we'll probably do it before.
Yeah, we follow every other process with public hearing. It's not the individual mailing.
I guess what I'm not clear here, though, is that it just says it's not required if 10 or more parcels owned by 10 or more persons are subject to the bylaw amendments. It doesn't actually say, then we will do another process, or it just says it's not required. So,
We can just add that in.
yeah, something indicating that we would then
And
follow.
the rationale
Yes.
behind that. Okay.
Right,
Because I
but-
took that just from the act, but yeah,
Right.
can you have a little more context in there as to, it's not like we're going to ignore you. You've got
Right, but
11,
that's-
so we're leaving you out.
Right, that's
Okay,
right. That's kind
okay.
of what I'm reading there.
Sure.
Okay. Page 100, under 6.9, it says, a notice sign or sign shall be posted for an OCP amendment, a zoning bylaw amendment, a development variance permit, a temporary use permit. Do we also not need one for a development permit?
Through the chair, we haven't traditionally, and we haven't for subdivision. So it would be, if that is something we should do, or something over a certain size, but we haven't usually conventionally, or at least consistently, in terms of the posting.
How does the community find out about it then?
It's usually through our reporting process.
Right. So if they're not paying attention to what we're actually reporting, stuff could start happening in an area and they don't know about it because there's no sign out there.
Historical.
So historically, as we do today, we do the sign at the property for an official community plan amendment or a zoning bylaw amendment. And these help to meet the specific requirements in the Local Government Act that are around that specifically. There are no requirements in the Local Government Act to notify anyone of a development permit. So we have not been asking for signage or direct mail out, anything of that sort. So what we have relied on and the district has successfully done, I think, is that through the neighborhood associations, they are the ones who are informed of form and character development permit applications, which would have an impact on the community. And the variances are the same, except if they are specific to a house. So any variance of a is sort of sent out as well. So it's important that recognizes the importance of belonging to a neighborhood association because they should be notifying their members of those applications.
Is that too going to the advisory planning committee?
All of the development permits for form and character go to the,
Advisory?
yes.
Okay.
So if I may, that would be an area that would be useful to get some feedback on. We haven't traditionally done that. It certainly came up with one of our larger subdivision applications. So under the legislation, no, we are not obligated to do that. Not everyone follows the community association, and not all community associations are as active as others. So if it is something, or there's a variation of that, I know in some other communities, it won't necessarily be notice posting the property, but there's notice that's actually in the newspaper under your basic, municipal news. Here are applications. So it could be our website. It could be a number of things. So there may be some, there's statutory requirements, and then there's what makes sense from a good neighbor perspective. So there's a number of options there.
It may be worth going the extra mile and actually having those properties posted. Nobody likes surprises in their neighborhood, I suppose. And at least visually that has been done within the neighborhood, because not everybody reads the paper or follows our website. So something to be considered, I would suggest.
Maybe we could have staff come back with alternatives for this, right? So a sign or in the paper or something where the community can actually get the information and
Well, if
notice.
there was a sign on the property, they'd initially get the information there, and then the inquiries would start accruing, I'm sure. But it may not be required, but what I'm suggesting is we may want to look at that. Okay. Yeah. Angela?
One thing that maybe council would want to consider is if we do have a development permit for form and character, how do the comments from the public, the reason we've struggled with this before, the rezonings actually have a cutoff date of the public hearing,
Right.
and no other comments can come in. If council's going to consider comments from the public on a development permit, like for form and character, then we may wish to consider putting in some kind of notification and cutoff date so that staff have time to address those issues or bring them forward. Because if it's done just to the meeting date of the council, it's difficult to record
Right.
them.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think you guys need to give some more thought to that and come back to us with something on that one.
Okay. Good.
Okay, here's another one, page 102. So this is personal to me, and I know that it's done differently in different, communities. Currently here, we give a bylaw or a zoning application, amendment, etc., official community plan amendment. We give it first reading, and then we send it to public hearing. I know that I looked at Gibson's, they do first and second. I looked at the regional district, they do first. I looked at other municipalities, and it's all over the map. Some do first and second, some do first and go to public hearing. Personally, I have a preference to go first and second. First kind of puts it out to the community. Second allows us to do any kind of amendments before it goes to public hearing, and then back to third. But I don't know where the rest of council sits on this, and I don't know what staff is suggesting here. I know this is how it currently is.
Do you mind? It's okay. If I may, Mr. Chair and members of the committee, I think that from a personal perspective, yes, you need to make amendments at the second reading. If we followed first and second and then public hearing, if there were things from the public hearing and the public input process that came forward, council would have to go back to second reading regardless before they went to third. So I think that having those kinds of dates works, but it's up to, because I think we've had significant input from the public through the public information meetings, through public hearings that have changed some of the bylaws, and that we've had that kind of input happen. And I wouldn't want to see us keep going back to second and then forward again. So it's kind of like the first, and I know other communities, they actually bring it forward to council that before they even go to first reading, they have a full report, and that the motion is then that they go to first and second through all their recommendations, and it's already had its referral, and they have everything in front of them ahead of time. So those are things to think about.
If I may add to that too, and I know we had some discussion earlier about the permission to proceed kind of process, which Angela's alluding to. It's that in some communities where you do go to second reading, they've had that extra step. And so this approach, because we had some internal discussion about would that make sense, and it turned out that, well, the way we actually do it of just asking for first and schedule a public hearing almost functions that way. If council was to get a report at first and felt very uncomfortable with it, and really didn't want to proceed, that's the opportunity to say we don't want it to proceed, and direct accordingly. So that could be the trade-off. I know it's certainly more common to have first and second, but it really depends on, I think where there's a lot of variation in communities too is how much goes beforehand, or the committee nature of the committee recommendations. But it's certainly something we could include a little bit more information on if that's a desire.
I guess what I'm trying to balance off is the amount of time that a proponent and staff put into an application before it potentially shows up here and gets, put on the back burner, or has to go back for total redevelopment. And I don't know how we balance that off inside of the process that we're required to do. Because there are many times when staff put a lot of effort and developers put a lot of money into putting together a proposal that comes to first reading and then has to get totally redone, before it even goes to public hearing. So I'm not, you get where I'm going with this. I don't want staff and or the developer to spend a lot of time and money to get to a place where it's not going to go anywhere. And I don't know how to kind of work with that.
I think I'm in agreement with you that on representing staff and the developer, that it would be nice if we could have a one-pager sort of thing, indicating what the proposal is, the parameters of it, and maybe options or recommendations at that point. Because there's been a few come forward I would have just turned down right at the get-go, personally. That's just me personally. But it does allow council to have a look at something which is coming down the pipe very early in the stages, and it may save an enormous amount of work for staff as well as the proponent. So I'm in agreement with what Councillor Seegers is saying with respect to that in terms of preliminary reports. Councillor Lutz?
And I'll disagree. I think that for staff and the developer to go through the APC and hear recommendations from them that come to council at first reading gives us an opportunity to refer it back to staff and developer before we've gone ahead with 2 readings into public hearing. So for that reason, I think status quo is working well, and I wouldn't want to see it change.
So these are some points we can bring up when these minutes get discussed. Angela?
One of the I've put to as an option to staff is that it would be really beneficial if all of council sat on the planning committee. Councillor Wright is here anyway. There's 4 of you. There are 2 missing, but that's the issue is you're not utilizing the committee session to hash out in detail a lot of the applications that are coming forward. And then going to council, it seems like the discussion happens all over
Okay,
again,
yeah.
or the input that comes from the other individuals, and Councillor Wright is important, but it's not heard at the committee level. So that's just one thing I wanted to point out, that I
good.
think it's very important to have, because I think our community is it's one of the most important parts of our community, the development applications. And to have the input of all of council at the committee level, I think helps both the developer and staff. Thank you.
So we're not suggesting that every committee be a committee of the whole. At this point, or staff are probably make their lives much easier. Yeah. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, page 106, 8.6. I believe it should say part 9 instead of part 10. Yeah. And then page 107, 9.3. It's just some duplicate words in the first sentence.
Yeah,
That's all in the bylaw.
yeah,
Thanks.
good. Thanks for those comments.
I'm good.
Everybody's good? Oh, that's good. Entertain a motion for recommendation number 2 then. So moved by Councillor Lutz, seconded by Councillor Seegers. All those in favor? Oh, you had a question, I'm sorry. Okay, all in favor? Good, motion's passed. All right, then. There being no further business, we'll move to adjournment. I'd just like to thank, before we do that, this has actually been a very good session, believe it or not. No, seriously, it's been a good session. It's been a good session. There's been some important issues brought up and dealt with input from staff and from committees. So I'm very pleased the way this has gone, especially as I didn't know I was going to be chairing. So thanks very much. Much appreciated. Motion to adjourn. All in agreement? We're adjourned. Any questions, please? Pam?
I just was wondering what happened to the APC suggested an elevator on the, I don't know what to call it, based on height. And I think it was brought up at one point. Somebody said, instead of saying perhaps in the future, that they should drop in the future, because then that